I found Enlil-kiag's tablet because I was looking for something else. Tracing foundation deposits from 3rd millennium Sumerian temples, trying to understand why so many early Mesopotamian structures incorporate astronomical alignments that seem too precise for the technology we assume they had. But the deeper I went into those foundation chambers, the more I realized the alignments weren't the real story. The tablets were. Scattered among standard dedication inscriptions and building records, there are confessions. Scribes who wrote things that contradict official mythology, then buried them where only future excavators would find them. Enlil-kiag's tablet is one of these. What he described, what he copied from even older sealed records before the priests caught him, doesn't match the history we've been taught about ancient Mesopotamia. Let me explain what I mean by sealed records. The Sumerian King List exists. It's real, readable, housed in multiple museums including the Ashmolean as WB 1923.444, compiled around 2100 BCE but claiming to record kingship extending back thousands of years before that, to a time before the flood swept over and kingship first descended from heaven. Scholars describe it as a mixture of myth, legend and historical information. That's the safe interpretation. But here's what makes it impossible to dismiss as simple mythology. The King List doesn't just claim kings ruled long ago. It provides specific reign lengths that create a mathematical problem no mainstream explanation adequately addresses. Consider the numbers. According to the King List, 8 kings ruled 5 cities before the flood. Alulim of Eridu ruled 28,800 years. Some versions say 67,200. Al-Algar of Eridu ruled 36,000 years. Enlil-kiag of Bad Tibira ruled 43,200 years. The pattern continues through 8 rulers across 5 cities. The total pre-flood period, depending on which version you consult, ranges from 241,200 years to 456,000 years. Then the flood. The King List states this explicitly. Then the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again, but now to the city of Kish. And suddenly the reign lengths become normal, 23 years, 17 years, 40 years, human lifespans. The contrast isn't gradual, it's a hard break. The standard academic explanation is that these are corrupted records. Scribes made copying errors over centuries. The numbers represent something symbolic rather than literal, perhaps lunar months converted incorrectly, or dynasty lengths compressed into single reigns. Reasonable theories except for one detail that has troubled researchers since the King List was first translated. The consistency. Multiple independent versions of the King List survive. They were copied in different cities by different scribal schools across several centuries. The numbers vary slightly between versions, but the pattern holds. Pre-flood kings have impossibly long reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. Post-flood kings have normal human lifespans. The flood marks the break. Every single version maintains this structure. Enlil-kiag had a different interpretation. He wrote that these weren't corrupted king lists at all. They were records of something else. The pre-flood kings weren't human rulers whose reign lengths got exaggerated through myth-making. They were the sky beings themselves, the ones who ruled directly before humans took over. The numbers don't record how long human kings reigned. They record how long the visitors stayed. This interpretation appears nowhere in mainstream Mesopotamian scholarship, but it appears in Enlil-kiag's tablet, and he claims he's copying from foundation records sealed by the Eridu priesthood in the early 3rd millennium. Records that describe the pre-flood period not as legendary human history, but as the time when kingship literally descended from heaven, when beings from above established cities, taught the arts of civilization, and ruled directly before departing. The language supports this reading. The King List doesn't say the early kings claimed descent from the gods. It says kingship itself was lowered from heaven. The Sumerian term Nam-lugal, kingship, combined with Antar from heaven, followed by Ed, descended or was brought down, not metaphorical divine appointment, physical descent. After the flood, the language shifts. Post-flood kings don't descend from heaven. They're appointed by gods now described as residing in temples, receiving worship, speaking through priests. The relationship changed. Pre-flood entries describe direct rule by sky beings. Post-flood entries describe rule by human kings claiming divine authorization from gods who no longer appear physically. Enlil-kiag noticed this pattern. He was trained in the temple, which meant access to foundation tablets the public never saw. He learned archaic cuneiform styles, the pictographic writing from before 2900 BCE that predates the simplified wedge impressions most scribes were taught. And he compared versions, public tablets versus sealed foundation deposits, the King List circulated among educated scribes versus the tablets buried in temple chambers when cities were founded. The differences, he wrote, were deliberate. Here's the temporal math that matters. Enlil-kiag was writing around 2900 BCE, shortly after cuneiform transitioned from early pictographic to more standardized forms. A scribe working in 2900 BCE with access to foundation tablets would have been reading texts 500 years old, possibly older. Those tablets would have referenced events before the flood as already ancient history. The oldest temple records felt impossibly ancient to the scribes who first learned to write. They were copying stories passed down orally, cities founded by beings who descended from the sky, measured the land, established divine laws called me, and then departed. By 2900 BCE, when Enlil-kiag was trained, the temples had already begun standardizing this mythology. The old foundation tablets with their archaic cuneiform and their uncomfortably specific sky descent language were being sealed in chambers, replaced by newer versions that made the gods more abstract, more eternal, less like visitors and more like cosmic powers that had always existed. The King List wasn't the only document making this claim. That's what stopped me from dismissing Enlil-kiag's interpretation as the delusion of a single scribe facing death. Because when you look at Sumerian foundation myths across multiple independent city-states, the same language appears everywhere, not borrowed, not copied from a central source, independently recorded by different scribal traditions in different cities, all describing the same event, kingship descending from heaven before human rulers took over. Eridu, the oldest city according to Sumerian tradition, claimed its kingship was lowered from the Abzu, the cosmic waters above and below the earth where the gods dwelled. The Eridu King List fragment, distinct from the composite King List, describes the first ruler Alulim as receiving sovereignty directly from An, the sky god, in a physical transfer of the Me, the divine laws or powers that governed civilization. Uruk's foundation myth, recorded in the cycle of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, describes how the city was established when Inanna descended from heaven, carrying the Me she had taken from the sky god's temple. It describes her journey as physical descent, her acquisition of the Me as theft of physical objects or knowledge, and her establishment of Uruk as the act of implementing what she brought from above. Nippur, the religious centre of Sumer, claimed Enlil, the storm god, descended to measure the city's boundaries and establish its temple as the axis connecting heaven and earth. Temple hymns from Nippur describe this measuring as a physical act, complete with technical terminology for land surveying and architectural planning. Lagash foundation inscriptions describe the city's patron goddess Bau, descending to establish the city's temple and agricultural systems. The inscription specifies she taught irrigation techniques, established barley cultivation, and organized the temple economy before withdrawing to heaven, leaving human rulers to maintain what she had created. The pattern isn't subtle. 5 major cities, independent scribal traditions, all claiming their kingship and civilization, were physically established by beings who descended from heaven, taught specific skills, organized society, and then departed, leaving humans to continue what they had started. Not 5 variations of the same borrowed myth, 5 independent testimonies to the same remembered event. And then there are the cylinder seals, these small stone cylinders carved with intricate scenes and rolled across wet clay to create official signatures and sealed documents, survive by the thousands in museums worldwide. They're visual records created by artisans who carved what they saw or what they were instructed to represent. Pre-flood cylinder seals, those archaeologists date to the Uruk period before 2900 BCE, show consistent imagery that's difficult to explain as purely symbolic. Skyboats, often with star symbols, beings descending from above, depicted larger than humans and often with attributes suggesting they're not human, unusual headgear, radiant symbols, non-standard proportions. Scenes of these beings among humans, teaching, measuring, presenting objects that recipients receive with gestures of reverence. Post-flood cylinder seals, those from the early dynastic period after 2900 BCE when city-states were fully established, show different imagery. Gods now sit enthroned in temples. Humans approach them with offerings. The gods receive worship rather than walk among humans. The visual vocabulary shifted from descent and instruction to residence and reverence. The same transition the King List records in text appears in the visual record independently. Enlil-kiag noted this in his confession. He had access to cylinder seals stored in temple archives and described comparing their imagery to newer seals and recognizing the pattern. Pre-flood seals showed gods as visitors among humans. Post-flood seals showed gods as recipients of human worship in permanent temple residences. The flood itself functions as the explicit reset point. The King List doesn't treat it as legend or metaphor, it marks it as a historical break with the formula. Then the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again, but this time to Kish, and this time the rulers have human reign lengths. Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic describes the flood as a deliberate divine act, one family preserved by Enki who warned them to build a boat. After the flood, the gods establish a new covenant, direct rule replaced by divine appointment of human kings. The pattern emerging from these independent sources isn't mythology evolving naturally over time. It's memory fading systematically. Pre-flood records describe direct contact. Beings descend, establish cities, teach skills, organize society, then depart. The flood resets the world. Post-flood records describe inherited authority. Gods who once walked among humans now reside permanently in heaven, appointing human kings who rule on their behalf and maintain temple worship. Enlil-kiag recognized the behavioral distinction. Pre-flood gods act like visitors establishing an outpost. Arrive, build infrastructure, teach the local population how to maintain it, depart. Post-flood gods act like distant rulers, issue commands through dreams and omens, demand tribute through temple offerings, never physically appear, visitor behavior versus resident deity behavior, and then he revealed what the priests didn't want known. The temples maintained 2 sets of records. Public tablets that educated scribes could access, containing the standardized mythology taught throughout Mesopotamia, eternal gods who created humans to serve them, kingship as divine appointment, temples as the gods' earthly houses, and sealed tablets buried in foundation deposits beneath temple floors, containing older versions that described the gods differently. As beings who descended, ruled briefly, taught intensively, and then departed before the flood, leaving humans to continue civilization without direct supervision. The priests knew the difference between the 2 sets of tablets. They controlled who learned archaic cuneiform. They decided which foundation chambers could be opened and which remained sealed. They determined which versions of myths were copied for public circulation and which were buried to preserve them for the gods while ensuring humans never read them. Not mythology evolving, memory being managed. The evidence of deliberate suppression didn't emerge from theory, it came from excavation. When archaeologists opened foundation deposits beneath Sumerian temples, They found tablets that shouldn't have been there according to the official narrative, not dedication inscriptions, not building records, older versions of myths, copied in archaic cuneiform styles, deliberately buried beneath temple floors when newer standardized versions were being circulated above. Temple refuse pits told the same story, tablets discarded not because they were damaged, but because they were obsolete. Scribes had recopied them in updated language, then disposed of the originals in consecrated refuse areas beneath the temple complex. The archaeologist who excavated these deposits in the early 20th century noted the pattern but interpreted it as normal archival maintenance. Enlil-kiag's tablet suggests something else: institutional editing. The Gilgamesh flood narrative exists in multiple versions spanning several centuries. The earliest known version, from Old Babylonian tablets around 1800 BCE, but copying Sumerian originals from centuries earlier, describes the gods' response to the impending flood with specific language. They ascended to heaven, fleeing the destruction. The imagery is physical: gods leaving earth, returning to the sky, abandoning humanity to drown. Later versions from the first millennium BCE describe the same event differently. The gods withdrew to the highest heaven or wept for humanity. The language became more abstract, more emotional, less spatial. The earlier version implies gods could leave and return to a physical location. The later version makes their separation from Earth metaphysical rather than geographical. This pattern appears across Mesopotamian mythology as city-states consolidated power in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. Earlier versions of temple foundation myths describe gods descending to build, then departing. Later versions describe gods eternally present in their temples, merely choosing to manifest or withdraw their favor. The rewriting wasn't accidental drift. It was systematic revision serving a political function. Consider the problem kingship faced in the early dynastic period when Enlil-kiag was writing. Rulers claimed authority through divine appointment. But if the gods were visitors who had departed, what validated current kingship? The gods couldn't be visitors who left. They had to be eternal cosmic powers who had always existed, ruling through appointed human representatives. Visitor mythology threatened this legitimacy. It had to be rewritten. The temple hierarchy controlled the revision process. Only authorized scribes learned archaic cuneiform. Only senior priests could access foundation deposits where the oldest tablets were stored. When temples were rebuilt, foundation tablets were examined, recopied in updated language if their content was deemed suitable, and reburied. Unsuitable content, material describing gods as visitors or containing too much technical detail about their descent and departure, was buried without public copies being made. Scribes who resisted this control were removed from temple positions. Enlil-kiag describes this in his confession. He had been assigned to catalogue foundation tablets during a temple renovation. He recognized discrepancies between what he was reading and what the public versions taught. He began copying sections secretly, comparing sealed texts to circulated myths. When senior priests discovered his unauthorized work, he was dismissed from temple service. By that point, he was elderly and dying. They couldn't retrieve what he'd already copied. The sequence mirrors the pattern I keep finding in suppressed history. Older records in restricted access. Approved scholars create new standard versions. Old versions are buried in the name of preservation while ensuring no one reads them. Unauthorized examination is forbidden. Access restriction. Priestly revision. Burial. Authorized forgetting. Each step plausible on its own. Together they form something systematic. And then there's the flood narrative itself. What if its function in Mesopotamian theology wasn't primarily to explain ancient catastrophe, but to create a historical break that allowed dismissal of everything before it as legendary? The flood becomes the perfect dividing line. Before it, the mythology says, the world operated differently. After it, the world we know began. Anything from before the flood can be relegated to myth and legend. Anything after can claim historical validity. The flood story might record a real event, but its narrative function is erasure. It authorizes forgetting. The timeline isn't subtle. The pre-flood period, recorded in the King List as lasting 241,200 years, describes sky beings ruling directly. Technical language about descent, measurement and teaching appears consistently across independent sources. Cylinder seals show visitor imagery. Temple foundation myths describe gods establishing cities, then departing. Then the flood, a historical reset. After the flood, kingship descends from heaven again, but now to human rulers with normal lifespans. Gods transition from visitors to temple residents. The mythology shifts from contact to inheritance. Enlil-kiag copied what he could before the priests sealed the chamber. His confession lists specific tablets by their opening lines, a cataloguing method scribes use to reference texts. He describes foundation deposits beneath Eridu, Uruk and Nippur, temples containing versions of the King List, with additional entries not found in the standard compilation. He references cylinder seal impressions in temple archives showing skyboat iconography, more explicit than any seals in public circulation. He names senior priests who authorized the reburial of archaic tablets without public copying. His purpose wasn't to overthrow the priesthood. He was dying. He had no political ambitions. He simply wanted the memory preserved. He pressed his confession into clay, fired it for permanence, and instructed his family to bury it in a foundation deposit beneath a smaller temple in Uruk, where it might survive until a future generation found it. His hope was that a future scribe who understood archaic cuneiform would compare his references to surviving foundation tablets and verify the pattern. The Sumerian King List survives in multiple museum versions. Cylinder seals from both periods are catalogued and photographable. Foundation tablets continue to be excavated from Mesopotamian sites. What we've lost is the oral testimony. The last scribes trained in full archaic cuneiform, who could read the oldest pictographic tablets fluently, died out in the 2nd millennium BCE as writing standardized. Their knowledge of how to interpret the most archaic inscriptions disappeared. We can still read the signs, but nuances of meaning and technical terminology that predate later theological vocabulary were lost when the last masters of that tradition passed without students continuing it. And somewhere beneath Mesopotamian sand, Enlil-kiag's testimony waits the same way it's been waiting for 4,000 years. For someone willing to read what the last witnesses actually recorded instead of what we've been taught they should have remembered.